Internationally renowned energy expert and public speaker, Dr. Scott Tinker is the director of the Bureau of Economic Geology, the State Geologist of Texas, a professor holding Edwin Allday Endowed Chair of Subsurface Geology in Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin, director of the Advanced Energy Consortium, and chairman of the Switch Energy Alliance. He spent 17 years in oil and gas industry. This is the Energy News Biz interview series. To support it, please check out our advertising options in the description. Thank you. And now, here's Scott Tinker. Who is Scott Tinker?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's nice to meet you. And who knows this year, Arn? But certainly a geologist and studied energy for over 40 years. And traveled the world doing that. Been in 40 countries, 50 countries, 60 countries now, looking at energy from those who have nothing to those who have abundant energy and its impacts on the environment and the economy, and make films and host a PBS show and just try to really bring that understanding that we have to the broader public and engage with them in very unbiased and nonpartisan ways. That's the attempt. And we're all biased, but the attempt is really to share the pros and cons, kind of the ugly and the pretty side of all forms of energy, because nothing's perfect. So that's what I do.
What's the message you would like to transfer to the world from your experiences?
I think the biggest message is that we're not doomed. We have time, but we always have to continue to advance and progress. And then, in a broader sense, just to engage and think. It's not simple. I think the big message is this is not simple systems. When you integrate energy and the environment and the economy, which happens no matter what, it's not simple. Pretty complicated, actually, but it's solvable. So I think the big message to young people particularly, but everyone, is we got to address the complexity, and then we'll be able to really move forward. If we make it too simple, it doesn't work.
What was the motivation behind Switch Energy Alliance?
Oh, well, I met a filmmaker 15 years ago named Harry Lynch, and he's a brilliant guy. He's the brains behind all this. I'm just a pretty face. And he was making a film at the time on energy. He actually makes films on everything, but interviewed me for that. And we made a film called Switch, filmed in 2009 and 10, and post-production 11, released it in 2012 on global energy. We went to 11 countries around the world looking at the best forms of energy and for each class, if you will. But there are pros and cons. They all have challenges. And that motivated us to, when that film came out, it became quite popular, particularly in universities and classrooms. So he went off and did a big thing on mental health. And I tried to improve mine and kept lecturing. And then we got back together and we agreed that we hadn't covered half the world, which was the part of the world that doesn't have much energy or any energy, nothing reliable. Turns out that's 4 or 5 billion people out of the 8.2. So we made a second big film called Switch On. The first film was Switch. And of course, a whole lot of content between them. And that's when I formed the Switch Energy Alliance. That recording and filming of the Switch On was done in around 2018, 2019. We released it in 2020, right at the beginning of COVID. And that's when we formed the Switch Energy Alliance before that, around 2018 or so. The goal there is just to inspire an energy-educated future, just to get folks information and allow them to think about these things in ways that are digestible, but again, deeper than I think some of the dialogues that are going on today. So that's the motivation.
Actually, that was my next question, but very well said. How do you measure the impact of your work on communities and environment?
Yeah, measurement's important. Metrics matter. It's not easy. We can count things like everyone. We can count, how many clicks things have, how many views things have, audience, and responses that way. We can see the measures that most things allow us to see, but the impact is a little tougher. What's really our minds changing? Are people thinking deeper? Are they engaging with one another? I call this overlap space between energy and the economy and the environment, the radical middle. Energy underpins healthy economies, which allows us to invest in the environment in that overlap space. So we really start to look at that and see if there's progress being made. And that's across governments, across academic institutions, across industry, NGOs, and other places. I think there is. We hear back from a lot of people that they have been inspired by or motivated by or challenged by the things we do, and that it's causing them to act in some way, to think, to involve themselves, to improve their corporate practices, to better their government policies, to deepen their academic teachings, if you will. And that's when you know you're really having an impact, when people you don't know correspond from all over the world and say, hey, this really mattered to me, and keep doing what you're doing. So that's a nice form, and it's happening a lot now.
You opened a lot of eyes. Certainly, you opened mine with your work. And my question is, were there any companies who approached you after that, who wanted to help?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've seen energy companies. And, if you think about the proportion of energy consumption in the world today, probably not something everybody actually understands or knows, but it's still dominated by fossil fuels. Coal is very
Yes.
important in Asia and other emerging and developing economies. It's the thing. China consumes more coal than all forms of energy combined, other forms. And China's energy consumption alone is more than all the electricity in the world, just to put things in a scale perspective. China consumes more energy than all the electricity generated in the world. Electricity is only part of energy. So when you start to see coal so dominant still, and oil still driving our transportation systems, it's a great fuel for that. It's dense and you burn it and no residual, but it makes CO2, and that's one of the great challenges. Natural gas, of course, very versatile fuel, and makes power. You can put it in vehicles, plastics, and fertilizers. Natural gas is used for everything. We hardly know all the things it's used in. You add all that up, it's between 80 to 85%, depending on the number you look at, of use in the world still. And then you start to see hydro and nuclear, and those are big pieces as well. And then solar and wind are growing rapidly, but still just a small percentage because our demand for energy continues to grow. So this is the reality of the energy mix today, and it hasn't really changed much in percentage terms. A little bit of growth across the solar, wind, biofuel, biomass, waves and tides space. A little bit of growth in nuclear, mostly in Asia again, but that proportional mix has remained reasonably consistent, ironically, throughout the years. We just keep adding new forms of energy. So that's the great challenge we face, I think, is how to address energy for everyone, to lift the world out of poverty, that 5 billion people I mentioned earlier that our second film, Switch On, focused on, and maintain healthy economies in the rest of the world, and clean up the environment, the atmospheric emissions, to be sure, the climate, but also the land, the air, and the water. I'm a geologist, and I know and understand all that has to happen to build energy collection systems, whether they are drilling rigs or coal mines or constructing solar panels or wind turbines or batteries. That all comes from the earth. It's all mined from the earth. The metals come from the earth, and we make these systems. We collect energy, and they wear out. These systems all wear out. We dump them back into the earth or the atmosphere. Landfill disposal is really prominent with solar and wind and batteries, and we do it again and again. So this is a very big challenge. Is how do you try to find some level of reduced environmental impact while still providing the energy, the reliable, affordable energy that the world needs to come out of poverty? And
My
again,
next
I'll
two
say this.
questions.
Yeah, I'll
are
just say
are,
this
are
real
pretty.
quickly.
Yeah.
If the world doesn't come out of poverty, none of this can happen, because it's billions of people. It's not just unjust. It is unjust, but it's more than that. The environment is harmed with 3 or 4 or 5 billion people living in some level of energy poverty. It hurts the environment because they just can't afford to focus on it. They have other challenges and other issues and other problems. So this link that, again, I think is so important to understand, this link between access to energy and the economic health and environmental protection.
How do you stay ahead of the energy curve?
How does one, or do I?
Uh,
Me personally?
how is the world?
Yeah. Oh, how does the world? Yeah, we have to think. We have to not. We have to avoid judgment of actions of different parts of the world. The world is very different. We have different socioeconomic systems and scales, different political systems, different energy resources, and different access to those based on our metals and other mined resources, liquids and coal. We have different educational levels. So you look at the world, it's very different. And we can't impose one system approach that might work here over there. You have to allow for a lot of variation in approaches to addressing this challenge of energy and the environment. And it will work then. It won't be perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good, and good is going to be pretty good. It won't be perfect. We won't maybe hit net zero by any time. I don't know. But if we can reduce emissions quite a bit, that's a good thing. That helps. We might not clean up mining and make it green, whatever that means. I'm a geologist. I don't actually think there is green mining, but we can make the process of mining better. Less water impact, less land impact, less soil impact, emissions and other things. So it's that the world's improving is what we're after. And to do that, you have to have healthy economies. Poor, impoverished economies, again, simply, they don't focus on these things. They can't. Yeah. And that's where we, in the very privileged world, and I'm not going to assume your status, but we're doing this.
Yeah.
We're privileged, and we won that lottery when it came to where we were born. And we have a lot of work to do to continue to improve the way we use energy and the amounts of energy we use to do our work. But we don't represent the world. About 1 billion people live in some state of wealth. And then you just start to come down from there, and it comes down pretty quickly. So I think we have to recognize, we, the privileged, wealthy world, have to invest in the rest of the world as they make their transitions in various ways and various paces, and ending up then hopefully where we get net zero poverty. That's what I'd like to have. I'd like to have net zero poverty in this world, and I think we can do that. That is accomplishable, but there's forces resisting it. Okay, I'll just leave it at that.
Can energy be cheap and clean?
It can, but it's hard. Cheap and clean and reliable. If I add the reliability, it's hard. So I can have things reasonably affordable and clean, and not my favorite word. I'm going to be honest here. Clean isn't my favorite word. What does it mean? Atmospheric emissions? Does it mean water impact, soil impact? Does it mean local air emissions? These are all parts of our clean environment. But I can have things that are reasonably affordable and reasonably clean, but they may not be reliable. And reliability drives everything. Right now, if our power went off, okay, we would end this meeting, visit that we're having. It wouldn't hurt. But if the power went off broadly, hospitals aren't functioning, emergency vehicles aren't moving, and refrigeration goes down, and food starts to rot, and let's say medicines that need refrigeration. And this is in the rich world, So getting all of that isn't easy. We have to kind of adjust our scales. I'm going to use this word, trade-offs, and it's kind of strong. There are trade-offs between these things, and maybe it's not a trade-off. Maybe it's just a balance. Maybe it's balancing the different components so that we achieve improvement in them, but not go too far. If we try to go too far in any direction, it really hurts the other ones. And that's what I feel is part of this educational process. We've got to really think deep about the trade-offs, the balancing, so we can move everything forward without hurting the other ones.
What energy surprises lurk ahead?
What energy surprises?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can maybe lay out a couple that are interesting to me. One is, for the first time last year, we were able to get more energy out than in the process of fusion. And that was fascinating. The laser intensity that went in was less than the energy released by that fusion. It was a national lab in California. That's pretty cool. Fusion has been this kind of always out there holy grail, but I think it's a lot closer than we realize now. And the neat part about fusion, that's, that fission, we get, step back, nuclear electricity from nuclear generation comes from fission today, splitting molecules. Uranium and thorium make heat, boil water, make steam, turn a turbine, and run a generator. It's just a different form of heat than burning coal, for example, or other heat sources of heat. So that's splitting things to make heat. Fusion fuses them together, and it's a lot safer. The reaction process has inherent safety in it. It shuts itself down, if it's not working. So it lurks, if you will. Progress is really happening, and I'm excited by that. There are no emissions from the process. It's very dense, which means the energy intensity from a little bit of input feedstock, if you will, or fuel, a little bit goes a long way, and that's energy density. Other things that lurk, we continue to see improvements in solar and wind technologies. They continue to get cheaper and cheaper. They're almost to a point where the actual generation can't become a lot cheaper. Now, this is where it's important to kind of say this. We hear wind and solar are now cheaper than other things. That when that number is quoted, that's something called the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy or levelized cost of electricity. That's where it's generated. That's at the plant gate. They've come way down impressively. So to get it to you, though, because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time, that's just the reality of physics. You have to have something redundant sitting there waiting to back those up if you want it reliable. And that's why I said reliable earlier. It matters. So to get that happening, that reliability redundancy is very expensive. And that's why Texas has a bunch of wind now, the most of any state in the country by far. And we see our electricity prices going up. California has a lot, and their electricity prices triple most other states. And Germany is 4 to 5x, 4 to 500% more, because of the cost of redundancy. And it's very important to be honest with the public about that cost. And people like the CEO of Ørsted, Mads, is being honest now, saying, look, renewable energy, solar, wind, it's just going to cost you more. That's just the reality of the physics. But we're seeing advances there. That's neat. I think some other lurking, the U.S. has pioneered shale, production from shale, oil and natural gas. We now export gas. We now export oil. 15 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. We were importing those things and our production was going down. 15 years. Okay. There's shale, and shale is the source. It's the organic muck that sources the conventional oil and gas around the world. It's where the kitchen is. It's where it's cooked by nature. There's shale all over the world. Wherever there's conventional oil and gas, Russia has a lot, the Middle East has a lot, Europe has a lot. Poland, Germany, other places. There's potential to produce oil and gas from those shales in the world. I think lurking around is the reality that the places I just mentioned, Russia and the Middle East, are doing that quietly behind the scenes because their conventional oil and gas is still cheaper. So they want to get that out to the markets, but it sits there. And we need it, particularly the natural gas. So that's kind of lurking out there. I could go on this.
Oh,
this
I
subject
I
forever.
was just
I'd say the
I
last
was just
one
going to
yeah, go ahead.
yeah to interrupt with hydrogen.
Yeah,
What do you think about the hydrogen hype?
hydrogen hype. Yeah. We've heard about the hydrogen economy for a very long time. And I think it's important to think about that natural transition. So we've come out of, let's think about the world. Humans have been around for a little while, always using hay and wood as our energy source when we were in caves. It hadn't been for the last couple hundred years that we went away from those some toward coal. And coal is just compressed wood and hay, organics that have been compressed into solid carbon. We call that coal. That's abundant and still used a lot. And then the transition to oil, hydrocarbons, more hydrogen in the carbon mix, and then methane, which is CH4, carbon and 4 hydrogens, and other gases, propane, bentane, butane, mixes, but dominated by hydrogen. So from that, you go to hydrogen. So you see this natural progression driven by physics away from carbon to hydrogen. And hydrogen is a very dense source of energy. It's a fuel. It burns. A bad example of that is the Hindenburg. It was a hydrogen dirigible. Boom. So it burns. But you can also use it as an electricity carrier, if you will, an energy carrier. So fuel cells, for example, in vehicles could be a wonderful option to liquids, gasoline, diesel, jet fuels. Dense, no emissions out of the tailpipe, and the hydrogen is the electricity carrier there. And a wonderful option to batteries, because batteries have a whole lot of challenges, electric vehicles, from mining to manufacturing to dump them. They're very toxic. We dump them in landfills. So the EV world it's fit for some things, but it isn't going to be a great solution to all the transportation needs. Fuel cells, I think, have a big role. That's hydrogen. So the hydrogen economy, if you will, is coming. Now, where's the hydrogen come from? Well, there's a little bit of it found naturally. We haven't explored for it that much. But remember, it's element number 1 on a periodic table. It's hard to keep track of. You think a helium balloon is light and floats away. Hydrogen's even lighter. So this is not easy. And it's combustible, as I mentioned. So you have to handle it very carefully. But it is found naturally. But mostly we make hydrogen by splitting the methane molecule, CH4, with heat, and you get a lot of hydrogen. And that's called, methane steam reforming is the process. Or you can split the water molecule, H2O, 2 hydrogens to an oxygen, and that's called hydrolysis. Now, this takes a lot of energy. Splitting water isn't easy. It takes a lot of energy in, and you get the hydrogen out. When you have to put a lot of energy in, that's cost. That's a cost that makes it expensive. So water, methane, natural hydrogen, different sources. And we have color codes for all these things. Now there's so many colors of the
Exactly.
rainbow. I don't know.
Let's
I don't
say
know what's what.
green versus blue versus gray. Which one wins?
Well, some will, again, I'm not a big, I don't think there'll be single winners. I think depending on the circumstance, each of those has a role to play. Green, blue, gray. I actually like pink. I think I have my color right there. That's nuclear being used as the energy source to either split the water molecule or the methane molecule. Nuclear, very dense, no emissions. Okay. So I don't have to do carbon capture from the fuel source, if you will, if I use nuclear as a power source. But, green hydrogen being generating hydrogen from water using solar and wind mostly, or some other, I don't use the word renewable because, again, we mine it, we make it, we dump it. It's not renewable. But solar, wind, or other sources that don't have emissions at the source and making it from water. So that's a low to no emissions process, but it's a very expensive one because
Yeah.
those things are expensive, as I've explained earlier. Making it from methane, probably what we're going to do for a while now. I think that's blue, if you will. And, splitting methane. And what do I have to do there? Because there's a carbon in there, CH4. So I have to, if I want no emissions or low emissions hydrogen, I've got to do something with that carbon. So that's capturing the carbon dioxide, and putting it back.
Do you believe in that technology?
In which technology?
Carbon capture.
Well, I don't use the word believe. I try not to. I think believe and deny is kind of more religious terms. In science, can we test it? Full disclosure, I've had a group for close to 25 years now, one of the largest in the country, United States country, who's been studying CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, it used to be called, or storage now. They put a U in it, carbon capture utilization for things and storage. Technically very doable. We've demonstrated over that couple decades that you can put reasonably large volumes of CO2 into the earth and store them there. How is that done? I'll be real brief on that. It's every little pore in the earth is filled with old water, old oceans. Okay, sandstones and limestones are filled with old oceans, salty water, nasty water. So it gets dissolved into that water. It's like your soda pop. I got 1% of CO2 in my soda. When you shake it open, it goes. That's more intense than we're talking about, even more higher concentrations than we're talking about in the earth. So putting 1% down in the earth, dissolving it or storing it, locking it up, is very doable physically, and not everywhere, in the right settings and at scale. Now, that said, what's the pros and cons to everything? It costs money. So you have to capture CO2 from somewhere, a smokestack or a CO2 stack, power plant, a hydrogen facility, a cement factory, et cetera, petrochemicals, refineries. Capture CO2, you compress it, because it's a gas, you compress it into a weird liquid phase, something called a supercritical phase, behaves like a liquid, move it along in a pipeline and put it into the earth, into that phase, and then it's stored there. That all costs money. Every piece of that equation, every piece of that supply chain, if you will, costs money. Who's going to pay? That's a big question. Where are the rents taken? Who's paying for the capture and the compression and the transportation, the injection and the storage? Governments? Well, that means everybody pays. The companies emitting it, okay, they pass that through the ratepayer. Those who use the energy, how about the big tech companies who consume so much electricity, like we're doing now? Maybe they pay into the system, etc. So that's all being worked out, but it costs real money to do that. So I think the science shows we could sequester quite a bit of CO2 in places around the world. The physics works. The economics and how those rents are taken is what's being worked out now. And it's starting in different places in the world. It'll be kind of fits and starts and intermittent, but I think it's coming. Will it solve the world's problems? No, of course not. It's one piece. It's a lever. It's a wedge of that CO2 reduction future. Nuclear is a wedge. Solar and wind are a wedge. Hydro is a wedge. Low emissions gas is all these different wedges in there that we can use to help reduce overall emissions, but still keep our energy reasonably affordable and reasonably reliable.
Back to hydrogen. How quickly will hydrogen drop below battery prices?
For transportation?
Yeah.
It depends, and I hate to say that, but it depends on the cost of your batteries. Those vary around the world. Let's recognize batteries have to have certain metals in them, okay? The supply chains for those metals, brilliantly, by the way, are controlled by China. China went out through its Belt and Roads Initiative, and even initiatives before that, and invested in technologies and regions of the world where they now control the key metals in the world, 80% of those metals, including now lithium and copper and other things, and polysilicates for the solar panels and the wind turbines, everything in that supply chain China controls. So the cost of batteries is going to depend on what China decides to do. And that's an interesting risk. You see China outcompeting Tesla now and outcompeting European EV makers big time. There's a war going on in the EV world, electric vehicle world, and China's winning. So how expensive? I don't know. How high does that go? Now, hydrogen fuel cells are coming in. They've been here a while. That technology's been around. But how much does it cost you to produce your hydrogen? Can you have some natural hydrogen nearby? Can I use methane? It won't be perfect in CO2 terms, but it's cheaper because it doesn't take as much energy. Do I have some extra wind and solar electricity around that I could do hydrolysis and make hydrogen without extra cost? So it depends on the generation of the hydrogen cost and the competitive electric vehicle battery cost. That's going to, again, vary by geopolitical circumstance. But I think you're going to see it happening in certain regions. It's going to start to happen. We're going to see hydrogen begin to come to competitive partly because the engine, if you will, the hydrogen engine, the fuel cell in that vehicle is a pretty good one. It's different, but it feels a little bit more like driving your combustion engine. And you can put hydrogen into a vehicle and get reasonable range from that. There's hydrogen filling stations literally in Europe. It doesn't take that long to fill your car with hydrogen, not like charging a battery, which can take quite a while. So I think it'll have some market competition or competitive advantages in certain regions.
Can hydrogen production keep pace with future needs?
That's going to depend on scale. I don't know. I'm guessing that it can, and this is my opinion. I'm not basing this on data now because we're out in that future. In certain regions, I think it will keep pace. We'll be able to create and make hydrogen because there's a lot of energy available to do that. And so demand always takes time. You grow your demand through time in markets as things get scaled and adapted into that marketplace. Again, we're talking mostly here about transportation systems, which are only part of our energy demand. But I think it can in those regions with a lot of energy and that can make the hydrogen. It may not keep pace if fuel cells, for example, become real prominent in parts of the world with emerging or developing, and they simply can't afford to keep up, if you will. Because moving
Talking about that,
hydrogen is hard. So these are two big things I haven't really talked about. But moving hydrogen, remember, it's element number one.
Yeah.
It wants to escape, and if you don't want any accidents because it is volatile. And then storing it. And this is one of the great challenges. We have a consortium at the Bureau looking at hydrogen storage only.
Yeah.
Bureau of Economic Geology, where I am. Storing it at scale. So you need it there in reasonably large volumes so you can have that, you can meet the demands because the demands are going to vary, and I have to have some source of hydrogen that I can put into that demand system as it goes up and down. So storage of hydrogen is a really important challenge if you start thinking about scaling it.
Now, let's go a little bit to the so-called white hydrogen, geohydrogen, or natural hydrogen, however you call it. Is it real? and does it have any potential?
Yeah, it's real. There are places in the subsurface where there's natural hydrogen concentrated, just like you have hydrocarbons, oil, methane, CH4. You have some places that have separated and concentrated hydrogen enough to be real. They're not that abundant. We haven't explored for it in a long time. But
is it truly carbon neutral?
Well, nothing is. There's nothing carbon neutral. Everything has carbon either in it or to make it or when we dispose of it. So carbon neutral to make it net neutral. So you have to do something with the carbon we produce to make it net neutral. To get that hydrogen out, you have to produce it, and that usually involves drilling for it, unless it's very near the surface. But you have to drill for it and produce it, and then I've got to move it, put it into pipeline systems, and densify it, and then I go do something with it. So all the processes along that chain have some carbon components to them, but it's a lot less carbon intense than, for example, making hydrogen from methane, CH4, which is going to produce that carbon piece, and you got to capture and do something with that. Hydrolysis is H2O, so in thought, in theory, less CO2 emissions from making hydrogen from water than from methane. Again, though, it's a pretty energy intensive process, so where does all that energy come from?
Can we produce enough geologic hydrogen to meet the demand from different industries and regions?
Not today. We just don't have enough that we know about. Now, if exploration goes on and we find a lot more hydrogen, and that often happens, you don't know what you haven't tried to find. So there hasn't been a lot of hydrogen exploration in the world. As we start to look for it, I think you will find some regions that have quite a bit, just like we did with methane. We didn't used to look for natural gas. It was a byproduct of oil. You flared it or burned it just to get rid of it. That changed. And now we've discovered over the last 20 years, methane is locked up in ice. It's frozen in ice and platerates, or hydrates, they call them, methane hydrates, in the ocean floor or Siberia where it's really cold. So we might find places there's natural hydrogen, so-called white hydrogen, where we just haven't tried to find it before. I could see that happening, but I don't have great data on that.
Will it be cheaper than regular hydrogen, would you say?
Again, it depends on where it is and what you have to do to get it to where it's needed. I can create hydrogen today wherever it's needed, whether I have water there or methane right there at the source where the demand is. So if I take the movement of hydrogen out of the process and create it right where it's needed, that's a big expense. Okay. So natural hydrogen, it is where it is, and it depends on where you need it. And that is a cost that goes in there. But if I had a bunch of natural hydrogen right where the plant that needed hydrogen or transportation sector, sure, because I wouldn't have to use the energy to generate it from something else. But that's might happen in a few places, but less likely. It's like wind, unfortunately. The wind seems to blow in big regions that are away from the demand centers, mostly, and we have to move it on giant power lines here in Texas. Sun, it's nice and sunny out in southwest U.S. in the middle of the desert, but that's not where LA and San Francisco and New York City are. So it's sunny in California. It's not where Seattle and Portland are. So you have to move a bunch of it just costs money to move energy of all kinds, whether it's an electron or in a pipeline or on a truck or a train or a boat. Just moving energy is expensive.
And finally, how will hydrogen change the geopolitics in the world?
As if and as hydrogen scales, because it can come from water, which everyone has, and methane, which is pretty broadly distributed, it changes the politics of energy. Right now, energy is controlled. Again, I mentioned coal. A lot of that is in Asia, where they're using it tremendously, and a lot of it in the U.S., some in Europe. Africa doesn't have much coal, neither does South America. Those are geologic resources. Oil, the same. Natural gas. If it comes from water or methane, which we can move around pretty well now, then we take out the politics of source, and that's powerful. Now, I gotta say it again. I have to have some energy to split the water molecule, a lot of energy, a little less to split methane. So where's that come from? Yes, if I have enough solar and wind, I could do that. It has its own challenges, but that's why I kind of come back to pink, Arns, and say, boy, nuclear reactors, really dense energy, small modular reactors, the large ones that China's building abundantly now. Russia and China are building 75% of the world's nuclear right now. So nuclear hasn't gone away. It's alive and well in China and Russia. We need to catch up again. But boy, I could split methane or water with nuclear. And now that changes the geopolitics quite a bit in terms of who controls the world's energy.
Scott, thank you for your time. It was a wonderful interview.
It's a pleasure. I've enjoyed it myself, and thanks for your thoughtful questions.